Welcome to Saturday's Warrior, the channel where we talk all things BYU, Big 12, and conference realignment. And as all BYU fans are well aware, there is a quarterback battle going on in fall camp. Still no QB1 has been named. And so I've invited on Joe Wheat, who is a contributor at BYU Cougars at Sports Illustrated, and also the host of the Hype Train podcast. Joe, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. Fan of the show.
Well, thank you. So I think it was last week you put you had an article go up on SI, this one, and breaking down this quarterback battle between Jake Retzlaff and Gerry Bohanan. No, please not Jake Heaps. I like him, but no. So
it feels pretty reminiscent, doesn't it? Like I feel like the last time we had a quarterback battle that had like this much implication to it, it was when it was Jake Heaps and Riley Nelson. So I think that the description is apt.
Well, and I think that kind of, yeah, you're right. It kind of tells you the state of our quarterback situation because, and we'll get into it, but while ultimately Riley Nelson won out and he had a lot of great moments and we love Riley Nelson and everything that he brought to the program, he was not one of our top programs over the last top quarterbacks in the program over the last several years. And so, I think both guys bring a lot, but there's a lot of downsides to both of them as well. And so I was thinking we could just go through and kind of talk about that, starting with Gerry Bohanan, and tell us what's kind of the conversation around him. What are the pros and cons and what he brings to BYU?
Yeah. So Gerry Bohanan, I want to get your insight on this too. Like, what was your reaction when Gerry Bohanan, when it was announced that Gerry Bohanan was transferring to BYU?
It's kind of,
Go ahead.
I wasn't super thrilled by, I saw that and I thought, okay, great. I guess that's all right. It's a good option as a backup, gives us a little more depth, but yeah, I wasn't too excited. I guess I still had that South Florida game in my brain.
Yeah, I think that's common. I think most of the time when if I had a nickel for every time a quarterback BYU beat transferred to BYU, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird it's happened twice, right? But I think like Keaton Slovis, when he transferred to BYU, a lot of what was in BYU fans' minds was, well, BYU beat him in 2019. And for Gerry Bohanan, it's like the last memory we have of him was throwing a pick 6 to Max Tooley, right? I think like in terms of how most BYU fans probably felt about Gerry Bohanan when it was announced he was transferring into the program was just kind of like meh. Like if that's the best you got, we're in a bad spot. And I get it. Like the argument against Gerry Bohanan's pretty simple. The last time we saw him, he was quarterbacking a 1-6 USF team. He has, by the time the season starts, the last time he would start a game was 686 days ago. There's just a lot of unknown, and the last we saw of him wasn't great. So I understand BYU fans' kind of hesitation. And I think kind of another argument for kind of against was, yeah, like we saw him at UCF. He won a Big 12 championship at Baylor, but he wasn't really the driving force of what made that Baylor team so good. You had an amazing Jeff Grimes-led offensive line. You had Abram Smith, who went on to play in the NFL. That Baylor rushing attack was absolutely elite, and it led to 12 wins that season for Baylor. In his career, Bohanan's a pretty limited passer, 59.6% completion rate, with a 2-to-1 interception to touchdown ratio for his career. Not great, but it's fine. But it's when you're used to, Zach Wilson and Jaron Hall kind of leading your program and being 2 of the most efficient quarterbacks in BYU history, that just doesn't leave a lot to be excited about if you're just kind of looking at Gerry Bohanan on the surface level.
Yeah. I mean, I think you summed it up really well. I think meh is is probably a lot of people's reaction, which is why during um, spring, everybody was expecting, well, Jake to really pull away, especially since Gerry wasn't full strength at that point. But Gerry's hung around and shown that he's still in this QB battle. And so, what are his strengths and what does he bring to the table that might help him win that?
Yeah, to your point, like coming out of spring ball, coaches were saying that Gerry was either really bad or really rusty at best. Like things did not look good coming out of spring ball. And apparently he got some stem cell injections into his shoulder. The reason he missed a year was because of pretty much reconstructive shoulder surgery, which it was pretty devastating and caused him to have to, relearn how to throw a football, which makes you really nervous. But I think a lot of those concerns went out the door when BYU posted their first practice highlights, and Gerry is throwing 45 yards downfield effortlessly. He's making those opposite hash comeback routes that Aaron Roderick's offense is known for, and he's doing it with a great arm motion. With a lot of zip on the football. He spent the offseason training with John Beck. My biggest concern for Bohanan was always his throwing mechanics weren't great. Even at Baylor, his throwing mechanics weren't great. He had a really tough time layering throws between, the linebackers and safeties. A lot of that looks like it's fixed based off of the limited practice highlights we've seen and, what I've been able to glean from talking to different people in the program. But on top of that, I think people don't give Bohanan credit. Like we don't appreciate how athletic Gerry Bohanan is. He's listed at 6'3", 225, had a 4-star rating in the 2018 class. So if you're asking like, why can't BYU get a 4-star quarterback? I mean, you got one in Gerry Bohanan. He squatted 610 pounds at Baylor, which is insane. For reference, Jalen Hurts got a lot of notoriety for his squats. I believe Jalen Hurts squatted 600 pounds when he was at Alabama. So Gerry Bohanan is stronger than Jalen Hurts is. He has elite speed. He's a 1,000-yard rusher for his career. I believe he would rank fourth all time at BYU for quarterbacks. But if we really want to get nerdy with it, I think the deeper you dig into the data, Bohanan's legs are like the elite of the elite. So in 2022, he averaged 6.9 yards, he's averaged 6.9 yards per carry for his career. And then the way I like to look at rushing is how explosive are you when you get the ball in your hands? And a good way to look at that is, percentage of your runs that go for 10 yards or more. In 2022, 24.5% of Bohanan's rush attempts went for 10 yards or more. And for reference for how good that is, Jaron Hall, his senior year, was about 16%. And Taysom Hill in 2014, which we all view as peak Taysom Hill, was about 24.3%. So in terms of explosive rushing ability, Bohanan is every bit the run threat that Taysom Hill was. With similar size, similar strength. And honestly, like I'm not saying Gerry Bohanan's going to be as good as Taysom Hill is or was, but he's got the mobility with his legs. And honestly, I think he's a little bit better of a thrower than Taysom Hill was. So I think there's a lot to be excited about in terms of him running the football and his ability to escape pressure. I think the offensive line was a huge concern last year and still is coming into this season. We saw a lot more sacks than we were used to. Gerry Bohanan, when he gets pressured, he only gets sacked about 10% of the time, which is incredible. Again, for reference, Jaron Hall was about 15% of the time, and Zach Wilson was about 22% of the time in his career. So when you're getting pressured, Gerry Bohanan has a great way of getting the ball out of his hands or scrambling and making defenses pay. Like one of the reasons BYU's third down offense was so bad last season was you didn't have a quarterback who can make plays with his legs. And so defenses would just say, okay, we're going to send the house against you, beat us with your arm, and Slovis and Retzlaff weren't able to do that. And so I think Bohanan adds that extra threat with his legs while still being a solid passer. I think it just adds a completely new dynamic to the offense.
So his running mobility, I'm just wondering, obviously the O-line, we're hoping that they've corrected a lot of the issues from last year, but does him and his mobility and escapability, or however you want to call it, is that helpful for an O-line that's struggling, or does it make it harder because they never know where he's going to be?
It's a good question. Unfortunately, I'm an accountant by trade, and so the answer is just kind of like it depends, or we'll see. Um, but he's not the kind of, like, based off of his film that I've been able to watch at USF and Baylor, he's not the kind of guy that's going to bail out of the pocket early. And I think that's where guys like Zach Wilson got into trouble, is when Gerry leaves the pocket, his intent is to run and to make a play with his legs. When guys like Jake Retzlaff or Zach leave the pocket, their intent is to extend the play, and try and get something downfield. And so their issue is they hold on to the ball too long. And I think we saw that with Zach on the Jets last season to some extent, where when things get really messy in the pocket, they leave. And that's the point where now the offensive line doesn't know where he is, but they still have to pass protect for him. Whereas when Gerry, if he's already out of the pocket, linemen can kind of dip out and move to the next player. So I don't see that as much of an issue. Again, when he is facing pressure, I think that stat that, he only gets sacked 10% of the time, I think it shows that his escapability isn't a problem for the offensive line, because it doesn't, by the stats, it doesn't lead to more sacks.
Yeah, no, it's an impressive stack. And then just playing devil's advocate here, against him, what do you think that his inclination, or however you want to call it, to run and to escape, that while it's great that if he's picking up yards on his legs, which is great because we lacked a running game last year, and hopefully LJ Martin's healthy this year, but do you think that in some way negates what might be our most potent weapon on offense, which would be our receivers?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's another answer of we'll see. One of the things I heard about Bohanan coming out of spring ball was he did have a tendency to kind of dip out a little too early if his first or second read wasn't there. From what I hear, that hasn't been an issue in fall camp. There have been times where Gerry has broken off, these really long runs, but from what I understand, like, neither quarterback is using their legs to excess. Like, both Gerry and Jake, frankly, are quarterbacks. Like, they're not athletes who can play quarterback. Like, both of them are good enough passers. And I think one thing that I really like about Gerry is he does like to air the football out. In terms of average depth of target, according to PFF, he sits over 10 yards on his average depth of throw. When he was at Baylor, he threw for 8.1 yards per attempt, and his touchdown to attempt ratio was better than Zach Wilson was in his career. So in terms of throwing the ball, I think Gerry's better than most give him credit for. I wouldn't say it's his biggest strength. To your point, like, we'll see if he's going to be a 1 or 2 read guy and escape the pocket a little too early. But Gerry does like to throw. And again, based off of the limited practice stuff we've been able to see, he is connecting with receivers downfield, both in and outside of the pocket. And I think that's really encouraging.
Okay. Well,
and then the other thing is, from what I've been able to glean from people inside the program, he has a great relationship with Darius Lassiter. I think most people would expect Chase Roberts to come in and be wide receiver 1 this year. I think it's going to be Darius Lassiter. He's told Gerry on multiple occasions, hey, if there's fewer than 3 guys on me, just kind of throw it up and I'll go get it. And again, based off of what we've seen from practice, that seems to work. I don't know how I feel about Gerry Bohanan thrown into double and triple coverage, but Lassiter's pretty good at bringing everything down whether he's covered or not.
Yeah, he's got a good track record. So I like that. And I like the confidence there. You made a comparison with Gerry Bohanan and Taysom Hill. You also mentioned the squats. We also saw reported that Taysom Hill also set some records this year in squatting. What was it? It was 6. It was something. I don't know. It was way too high to
something that would crush me if I don't even think I could get that off the rack. It's insane.
Yeah, I think I saw that it was like the weight of a grown elk, and I was like, okay, well. So anyway, so anytime you're compared to Taysom Hill, I think that, and Jalen Hurts for that matter, that's a good thing. So as I was mentioning spring, so it seemed like Jake was the guy. He'd been in the system. Gerry was recovering. But then the fact that Jake didn't come out of that, head and shoulders above an injured, rusty Gerry Bohanan is a little worrisome. But on the flip side of that, the fact that a healthy Gerry Bohanan has not yet been able to pull away from a guy that couldn't pull away from an injured Gerry Bohanan. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
So help us make sense of Jake Retzlaff and where he's at.
Yeah. So again, coming out of spring ball, I think most people assumed that Jake would be the guy. From people that I talked to, Jake had a little bit of separation there. I think most anticipated that, Jake would, working with John Beck during the summer, have a full off season in the playbook, that he would be able to pull away from Bohanan, and he just hasn't. And I think that's, in my mind, that's more of a credit to Bohanan, and the improvement that he's made versus Jake's ineptitude, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But if we're going off of what fans have seen, I kind of get it. Like, Jake was not a good quarterback last year. I don't think that 4 games should be a referendum on a quarterback's career, but his passer rating was 97.1. For reference, that was 395th nationally among quarterbacks, or among players that threw at least one pass. And there's only 133 college FBS teams. So being almost 400th in the country in passer rating is not great, no matter how you slice it. I think he showed some progress as he went along. Like, I thought his games against Oklahoma and Oklahoma State were better, but even those, like, his average depth of target against Oklahoma was like under 5 yards. So yes, that was his best game of the season, but it was also the game where he was limited the most and wasn't throwing downfield. So I think there's obviously some concerns there. He had twice as, like, his turnover worthy play rate was the worst by a BYU quarterback since Tanner Mangum in 2018. Rushing is arguably his greatest strength last season. When people wanted the change from Slovis to Retzlaff, it was because Jake was more mobile, but he had twice as many fumbles last season as he did rushing touchdowns. So you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of, can he take care of the football? He can have all the talent in the world, but if he's giving away the ball to the other team, it really doesn't matter. And I think the Oklahoma game was kind of the quintessential Retzlaff experience, where it's like, man, you have these flashes where that kid can be really special, but then he gives the ball away in these critical moments and it leads to an Oklahoma victory. That's going to stick in BYU fans' minds. And until he comes out and shows that, hey, I'm not that guy anymore, BYU fans are naturally going to question that.
Yeah. So I've been in Jake's corner since last year. I understand he came in at a difficult time, and you look at those opponents, that lineup that he came in cold against, and it was a tough lineup. And as you mentioned, he showed improvement. And I feel like giving him a full off season, a chance to settle in, has the reps, but more than anything, it was the hope that, if Gerry Bohanan ends up being QB1, like, great, I want it the best quarterback to start. I don't have favorites between them, but I was hoping that it would be Jake, because that would mean, great, that's going to give us some consistency instead of a new quarterback, for how many years in a row, because that means we had Jaron, then Keaton, then Gerry, and then somebody new next year. So that's at least 4 years in a row with a new QB1. And so for that reason, I've really been hoping that Jake could put it all together.
Yeah, and I totally see that argument. I've gone back and forth with my guy Casey Lundquist, who runs the BYUSI site, and that's his biggest point, is you should go with, like, if all things are equal, you go with Jake because he's got, more eligibility. My counter to that is, I think that was a better argument last season, when you pretty much only had 2 quarterbacks on the roster that were playable. You had Slovis and you had Retzlaff. This year, the quarterback situation is actually a lot better, in my opinion, than it was last year, because now you have 4 quarterbacks on the roster that have all started games at the FBS level. And so in my mind, like, if Jake hasn't improved, in my mind, it still doesn't make sense to play him this year just so you can play a bad quarterback again next year, right? Like, I think the coaching staff feels really good about what they brought in McKay Hillstead. Hillstead took an official visit to Utah out of the transfer portal, had offers to Utah, to schools like Ole Miss. He was a sought after player in the transfer portal. Started his true freshman season at Utah State and still has 4 years of eligibility as a redshirt freshman. So I think in terms of, what is your plan for the future? If Jake isn't able to go next year, I think the argument there is you let Hillstead, you let a guy like Trayson Bourget learn the offense, get comfortable in the system, and then they come back next year and, have starting experience with 3 more years of eligibility after that, if you really like Hillstead. So I think the urgency for Jake to play so that we can have continuity for next year, to me, you're going to be in a quarterback battle next year anyway if Hillstead is good. I think Retzlaff is better than he was last season. I'll have to see it to kind of believe it, but I think we're going to see that Hillstead is going to be pushing for the QB2 battle at some point this year to be backing up. I assume it's going to be Bohanan. Maybe by the time this show airs, we'll have a starter announced. But I think once Hillstead picks up the playbook, there's an argument that he's going to be pushing for that QB2 spot and then that QB1 spot again next year.
So I think you answered one of my questions, is who you think is going to end up winning the battle. You think it's Gerry. Do you see, like, both? It sounds like they're at least mobile to an extent. Both have some throwing deficiencies. Do you see any major difference between the two? Like, do you really think it is still that close, or do you think that that Gerry really is pulling away and the coaching staff's just keeping it close to the vest?
It's hard to tell. Like, I think they're still trading good days. I think if you would have asked me last weekend especially, I probably would have told you that Bohanan had the job locked up. It sounds like Retzlaff had a couple of really good days at practice this week, particularly Monday during media observations. The offense looked best when it was Jake. So I think they're still trading good days, which I think is a good sign for BYU fans. And there's a lot to like about Retzlaff. I think in terms of NFL potential, Retzlaff has the highest potential and most arm talent on the team. It's just getting those mechanics fixed up. Like, I've heard it said before that Retzlaff can make every throw on the field. The problem is he can't make them twice in a row. And I think that's the issue with Retzlaff, right? Like, you have these amazing plays, like, the deep ball to Keanu Hill last season against Oklahoma State, where you're just like, man, that kid's got it. And then the next throw, he's throwing it over Cody Epps' head on a swing route that ends up being a 6-yard loss. So if he can clean up those negative plays, man, like, there's a lot to like about Retzlaff. It's just how much can you actually clean up in just an off season? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering. So in spring, he'd not had any turnovers, and I don't know how that's continued throughout fall camp.
That makes. He's definitely thrown an interception in fall camp. He's definitely had a turnover. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, when I hear that a quarterback has 0 interceptions through 13 practices, my first thought is, okay, do our DBs suck, or is Jake just not taking any chances? Because practice is the time to make those plays. Like, you don't want your quarterback throwing 20 interceptions in 13 practices, but you want him throwing maybe like 5 or 6. So it's I don't read too much into that from Aaron Roderick. In terms of comparing the two quarterbacks, I think Gerry is going to be the safest with the football, which is probably why I lean Gerry. I think Gerry can get the ball consistently to BYU's playmakers in space, and I think he's the superior runner to Jake. Like, I don't think that, like, in terms of athleticism, I don't think those two are really that comparable. I think Gerry's the guy there. So again, I'm not in the quarterback room. I might be way off base with my information, but I think based off of what we can glean from other BYU insiders that have been at practice and kind of how the team is responding, from what I understand, I think Gerry is probably your guy going into SIU.
Yeah, it definitely seems to be swinging that way. I remember after spring, it's a lot of people were leaning Retzlaff if they had to choose, and now it's definitely swung the other way to Bohanan. That seems to be all indicators. That we just had another show. You and I were talking with Jerem Jordan, and he was on, and he very much thought Gerry Bohanan. He didn't really seem to have much doubt about that either. So that does seem to be how it is. I want to ask you, and you kind of, I think we've already discussed it, but just in terms of both of them and neither one truly pulling away, is this because neither one is really able to get it done, or is this really iron sharpening iron and both are continuing to get better?
Again, it's a great question, and it's the fall camp paradox: is are you good because your defense is bad, or are you good because you're actually good? Personally, I think I'm an optimistic guy. I have a podcast called The Hype Train. Like, what do you expect from me? I think it's more of an iron sharpens iron experience. Like, Jake hasn't been bad in fall camp. Like, I think it might sound like I'm more down on Jake than I am. I think there have been major strides that Jake has made in the offseason. I really do think that, this offense can be a lot better than it was last year, whether Jake or Gerry are taking the starting reps. I think BYU can make a bowl game with either of those two quarterbacks. And I think that's great news. I think BYU fans want this to be a close competition because both guys, frankly, especially Gerry, have an injury history. If Gerry goes out there and his shoulder, heaven forbid, his shoulder gets hurt again, I don't want there to be this massive chasm between Gerry's production and Jake's production. And then if heaven forbid something happens to Jake, I don't want there to be this massive chasm between Jake and the next guy. So I think the fact that it is so close is a good sign. Because again, with the experience that Jake has in the in the offense, if Gerry Bohanan is like running away with this thing after the first week of fall camp, I think that says a lot more about where Jake stands in the program than it does about Gerry necessarily being that great. So I personally think it's a good sign that things are so close. I think it means that both guys are making plays. But then at the same time, I think it shows that the defense is making plays too.
And then last thing, how do you feel like they are in terms of their leadership and the locker room responding to them?
Again, good question. I'm not in the locker room, so I can't give a definitive answer. To me, it sounds like guys respond to Gerry, really well. I think both guys have the respect of the people in that locker room. I think both would do an excellent job. Man, when you're in the weight room and you look over and your quarterback is squatting 605 pounds, it's hard not to follow that dude, right? Like when you have a guy who has a ton of experience, who has been in the Big 12 before and not just played in the Big 12, but has led that team to a Big 12 championship, it's hard not to get behind that guy. And then again, like if it were me, the last experience I have with Retzlaff is, the offense definitely got better when he was in there, but is there really a lot to be excited about when you're a wide receiver and your quarterback's overthrowing you on swing routes? Like in my mind, if it were me, I think Gerry would be the better of the two in terms of leadership because of that work ethic, because of that experience. And frankly, his performance on the field. I think quarterback battles are typically decided when the team decides who that guy is going to be. And I think we're starting to inch a little closer to Gerry being that guy.
Well, you've got me hyped and geared up. But Gerry Bohanan is going to take BYU all the way to the Big 12 championship this year. So I love it.
Why not, man? I wrote another article talking about how BYU, every single game on that schedule is winnable. So why not? Why not dream big, go 12-0? Don't do that, please. Bowl game is the standard for this season. Don't quote me on that and cut this clip. But I think there really is a lot to be excited about this BYU offense, man. I don't think this offense is going to be 120th in total offense again.
All right. So the article is a breakdown of BYU's most important quarterback battle in recent memory on SI.com. Joe, where can everybody find the Hype Train podcast, all your writings, and follow you on social media?
Yeah, man. At Joey27 on X. On Cougs on SI is a great place to find any of my articles. I always post them on Twitter, so that's a great place to find me. Listen to the Hype Train podcast. We're the second best BYU podcast behind Saturday's Warrior. Our last episode was the quintessential. What we like to say at the Hype Train podcast is we give you all the cogent stats and analysis, and then just throw that right out the window, and then just go full on fan mode. Our last episode was 45 minutes breaking down whether or not Kalani's job should be safe going into this season, followed by 45 minutes of BYU going 12, like predicting BYU going 12-0. So it's the full range of BYU fan emotion for sure.
Yes, I listened to that one, and you guys, you should go listen to it if you want a very positive and blue goggle view of the upcoming season, because you guys were much higher on my picks. I had us coming out probably 6-6, which is maybe not optimistic enough, but I would rather be surprised in a good way than disappointed when the season comes. So
high hopes, low expectations. It's what we do at the Hype Train Pod.
Absolutely. Well, great. Thank you so much for coming on, and really hope that to see this QB battle shake up pretty soon here. In the meantime, look forward to continuing to get all the updates from you and seeing your work. And please like the video, subscribe to the channel, go check out Joe and all his content. It'll all be in the description below. And as always, go Cougs.
Go Cougs, baby. Thanks, Trevor.